So the obvious and easiest answer to this question is Jesus would cancel anyone with whom I disagree. This is how a lot of people use their God for their ethics and their moralizing. It is Anne Lamott who said, "You can safely assume you've created God in your own image when it turns out God hates the same people you do." Let me unpack this idea of canceling, though, here at the beginning, because it's a relatively new way of describing a human social behavior that's been around for a long time. So I don't do this a lot, but I went to the dictionary. Merriam-Webster says canceling is this: to withdraw one's support for someone, such as a celebrity, or something, such as a company, publicly, and especially on social media, as a way to express disapproval and exert social pressure. So to me, that sounds an awful lot like boycotting and protesting, but there's a heavy dose of shaming thrown in. It is an effort to exert control by having someone or something removed, silenced, shut down. I think that's the newer element in canceling. The work is not just to refute or oppose a person, a company, or an idea. The work is to shut them down, to silence them. This morning, my question is this: what is the spiritual value of canceling? Whom would Jesus cancel? So here's my first answer: no one. As Peter Mayer says in the song we just had, Jesus would say, "Let everyone in." Jesus is a kind and forgiving person. All that stuff Paul says about love in 1 Corinthians, most people think that also applies to Jesus' character as well, and serves as a list of virtues that we want to embody for ourselves. Love is patient, love is kind, it says in 1 Corinthians. Well, the same is seen as true for Jesus. Jesus is patient, Jesus is kind. We all want to be patient and kind, right? I'm not just making this up out of nowhere. This is what Paul was aiming for us to hear when he wrote that letter. Paul was saying that we should be like Jesus, we should be loving, and that what that looks like is for us not to be envious or boastful or arrogant or rude, because that's what love is. Not envious, not boastful, not arrogant, not rude. Whom would Jesus cancel? No one. Whom should we cancel? No one, because love does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable. It keeps no record of wrongs. It does not rejoice in the wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. So canceling someone is about keeping that record and maybe a little rejoicing when it works, when someone who deserves to get canceled gets canceled. Yay. But that's not the way Jesus would do it. Jesus is all about forgiving those who persecute us. He calls us to love our neighbors, to love even our enemies. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." He did not say, "Blessed are you who can prove that you're right on the internet." No, blessed are the merciful, the pure of heart, the peacemakers, those who are persecuted. He specifically said, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for all the same ways they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So he calls us to turn the other cheek. That's not a lot of room there for rejoicing when people get canceled, let alone for us to be doing that canceling. So that's my first answer: no one. On the other hand, so here's my second answer. A careful reading of Scripture reveals that Jesus did get into it with some folks. He rebukes people. He called folks hypocrites. He argued with them. He flipped tables, chased folks out of the temple. In a 2022 article in The Atlantic on this very question, ethicist and editor James T. Keene writes, "Even a cursory look at Scripture shows that Jesus was not afraid to repudiate those who deserved it." So this idea that Jesus is a really nice guy who just loves everyone in his sweetness and light, It's just not true. He rebukes his disciples, Matthew 8, Luke 9. Peter, specifically in Mark 8, he repudiates these folks. At one point, he rebukes the wind and the sky and the sea. But these are examples usually of Jesus getting frustrated with his disciples, whom he loves, wanting them to be better people, more faithful and good. He wasn't trying to cancel them. So the rebuking part, that's a different conversation. But there's more. Jesus is often portrayed as criticizing and condemning the scribes and Pharisees of the church at the time. He says, "Woe unto you." This is in Luke and Matthew and Mark, all the synoptic gospels. More than once, he calls them hypocrites. Jesus did that because they were preaching the law but not practicing it, because they were enriching themselves off of the people, because they were giving the appearance of being godly and clean and righteous and loving, and yet their behaviors were not such. Then there is all this name-calling that Jesus does. He calls the scribes and Pharisees names, like vipers, serpents, fools, blind guides, whited graves full of dead man's bones and all uncleanness, at one point he says. In all four Gospels, Jesus is seen getting really upset at the merchants and money changers in the temple. And in John specifically, it describes him not only flipping these tables, but also using a whip to chase people out. Feels like Jesus, when pressed, singles out some people based on their hypocrisy, and he expresses his disapproval, and he exerts pressure to get them to change. So perhaps there are some people that Jesus would cancel. So my second answer is maybe there are hypocrites, for example, that Jesus would cancel. But here's my third answer. Still no. Canceling is not what Jesus was doing in those scenes in the gospel. He was challenging them, he was arguing with them, but he wasn't silencing them. Jesus was not shutting them down or telling them to shut up. He argued with them, he debated with them, he tricked them when they tried to trick him. Jesus argued with people, he prophesied against them, he called them names, yes, but he never demanded their silence. Keene, again, in that article from The Atlantic, says the only time Jesus tells someone to shut up or to get lost, it's Satan or his pal Peter, get thee behind me, right? Everyone else is free to argue with Jesus. So, Jesus would not advocate canceling. He would certainly advocate for argument, for consequences, yes, but he didn't silence people. He engaged with them. Look, this level of biblical interpretation is always fraught with personal bias. Let's take a step back for just a minute. Our modern interpretations are always loaded with our modern expectations and assumptions. In truth, what Jesus was saying and doing 2,000 years ago has very little that is directly applicable to most of what we're dealing with today. Not directly. It always takes a few steps, a few leaps of interpretation. So here is the hermeneutic behind my statement that Jesus would not cancel anyone. I'm doing that thing where I have a guiding value. And to be clear, it's the idea that God is love. And that this guiding value is the lens I use for every interpretation of Scripture. Period. I don't look at Scripture to figure out how to be loving. I look at love to figure out how to interpret Scripture. If you have a different way of interpreting, that's great. Own it. Be upfront with it. Mine is love. We speak the language of love. If there's something going on in the world or in your neighborhood that bothers you, the lesson from Jesus is not to shut it down or to try to silence your adversary. The lesson is to engage, come up with a better argument. Now here's a grain of salt. Most of the time, on the internet, such arguments are not real, and they are designed to waste your time and energy. Just like most complaints out there about being canceled are fake. Like complaints about the war on Christmas, just not real. Such complaints of being canceled are usually exaggerations and contrived so conservatives can appear like victims. In such cases, it is not wise to engage and waste your energy and time. But if the situation is real, then I encourage you to move closer to the situation and engage. That's what Jesus would do. I'm not recommending that you call people names and flip their tables. But to be fair, that is something that Jesus certainly did in some situations, so there is that. Truly, my advice is this. When you see trouble, move closer. Engage. Life is messy. I'm messy. My heart is messy. So is yours. I still encourage you to emulate that side of Jesus that is the embodiment of kindness, patience, and love. As Adrienne Marie Brown said in our reading, if the goal was to increase the love rather than winning or dominating a constant opponent, then we could actually imagine liberation from constant oppression. We're not going to build the beloved community by kicking some people out or shutting some of them down. We can change the world, but we'll do it through relationships. That includes some arguments and some conflict, some consequences, and calling for people to be better. Jesus never said just be a doormat. That's not in there. But the good parts of all of that happens only when we move closer to each other when we are having trouble. So let us start here, among ourselves. Let us engage across our differences through our conflicts as they arise. Move closer when we begin to see trouble. Our experience can then be a model that we each have out in the world for us to follow as we work to become a more beloved community together. Let us start here, and let us begin today, again. In a world without end, may it be so.